4 United States Navy sailors confessed to the same rape and murder, one after another facing the same detective in Norfolk, Virginia. Signed statements. Recorded details. 4 separate men, all guilty by their own words. Here is the problem. None of them did it. The DNA said so every single time, and every time it said so, the detective across the table did not release a man. He went out and found a new one. This story has 5 confessions in it. 4 of them were false. Keep count, because the man who collected the false ones ends this story in a federal prison cell of his own. Her name was Michelle Moore-Bosko. She was 18 years old, newly married to a Navy sailor, living in an apartment near the Norfolk Naval Base while her husband went to sea. On the night of July 7, 1997, someone she knew came to her door, and by morning she was gone, and one of the worst false confession disasters in American history had begun. Before this is over, 8 men in all will be charged with killing her. 7 of them will be innocent. The one guilty man will not be caught by detectives at all. He will mail his confession from a prison cell in his own handwriting, almost as a joke. And the astonishing thing, the thing this film exists to show you, is what the system did when the truth arrived in an envelope. It did nothing. So keep counting confessions with me, and keep one eye on the detective, because his ending is the one nobody saw coming. Norfolk, Virginia is a Navy town the way some towns are steel towns or coal towns. The harbor is gray with warships. Half the young men you meet are sailors, and half the doors in the apartment blocks near the base belong to Navy families. Young couples, new marriages, husbands gone for weeks at a time. It is a place built on absences. You marry at 19, you learn to sleep alone half the year, and the people across the hall become your whole world because they are the only world that doesn't ship out. Michelle and Billy Bosko were one of those couples. He was a teenager himself, out on a week at sea. She was 18, waiting for him to come home. 7 days. That was the length of the deployment. That is how fast a life can be standing there one week and gone the next. On July 8, 1997, Billy Bosko came home from the sea, opened his own front door, and found his wife dead. I am going to say what happened to Michelle once, plainly, because you need it to understand everything that follows. And then we are not going to linger on it, because she was a real young woman and not a plot device. She had been raped, and she had been stabbed, and she had been strangled. That is the crime. Now hold on to 3 quiet facts about that apartment, because they are going to matter more than anything the police do for the next 2 years. The apartment was small. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever did this was let in. And the wounds a medical examiner would note were tight, clustered, uniform. The signature of 1 hand, 1 weapon, 1 attacker. 1 attacker. Remember that number. It is the only number in this case the evidence ever supported. The police needed a suspect, and grief moves fast in a small apartment block. A friend of Michelle's, answering questions in those first awful hours, mentioned a neighbor from the building, a sailor named Danial Williams. He was 25. He had no criminal record. But he had seemed, she said, a little too interested in Michelle. That was enough. Within hours of the body being found, before the physical evidence had said a single word, Danial Williams was in a small room at the Norfolk Police Department, and the door was closed. What happened in that room took roughly 11 hours, and it ran through the night. Understand what an interrogation like that is actually built to do, because everything in this story flows downhill from it. It is not built to discover things. It is built to conclude them. The room is small on purpose. The chair is uncomfortable on purpose. There is no clock you can see, no window, no sense of whether it's midnight or morning. And the man across the table is not asking you what happened. He is telling you what happened and waiting for you to agree. Investigators told Williams they knew he did it. They told him they had evidence. They gave him a polygraph in the middle of the night and then told him he had failed it, which was false, and you should know, perfectly legal. American police are allowed to lie to you about the evidence. And in this room, they use that permission like a crowbar. Hour after hour, the same accusation from new angles. Deny it, and the denial is proof you're cold. Cry, and the tears are proof you're guilty. There is no answer that opens the door except one. And somewhere in the small hours, a new instrument came into the room. a homicide detective named Robert Glenn Ford. Hold on to that name. This film has plans for it. Ford took over the questioning, and Ford brought the hammer, the death penalty. Confess, and you live to fight it in court. Keep denying it, and Virginia straps you to a table. Innocence, at hour 9, stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like a fatal bet. A federal judge would one day describe, in a written opinion, how statements in this case were taken again and again until they said what the police wanted them to say. But that judgment was 19 years away. That night, there was only an exhausted young sailor who had never been arrested for anything, a locked room, and a man with a badge telling him the only way to see the sun again ran through the word guilty. Before dawn on July 9th, Danial Williams confessed to a murder he did not commit. He had been in that room through the night. The murder was barely a day old, the physical evidence hadn't even been processed yet, and the case, as far as Norfolk was concerned, was solved. And here is the detail that should have ended the case on the spot. He got it wrong. His account of how Michelle died didn't match how Michelle died. The method was wrong. The details were wrong. So the statement was taken again, and corrected and taken again, until it finally agreed with the crime scene. Read that back slowly. The confession did not describe the crime. The crime was used to repair the confession. Confession number 1. Mark the wall. One more thing about Danial Williams, because this case keeps finding new floors beneath the floor. While he sat in a cell that autumn, charged with capital murder, his young wife was dying of cancer. She died that November. He was not there. He was awaiting trial for someone else's crime. If Danial Williams had actually killed Michelle Moore-Bosko, this is where the story would end. A confession, a conviction, a closed file. Instead, in December 1997, the DNA came back. It was not him. The biology recovered from the scene, the kind of evidence that does not get tired at 3 a.m., does not fear the death penalty, and cannot be corrected across the table, excluded Danial Williams completely. In a working investigation, that is the fire alarm. It means the confession you built your case on is contaminated, and the killer is still out there. There is a version of the story where Norfolk hears that alarm, and Michelle's actual murderer, a name you will meet soon enough, is identified within weeks. That is not what happened. What happened is the single most important sentence in this film. When the DNA cleared the man who confessed, the police did not question the confession. They questioned the DNA's loneliness. Someone else, they decided, must have been there too. Someone whose DNA got left behind instead of Williams. And who do you look at when your suspect needs an accomplice? His roommate. Joseph Dick was barely 20, by every account a pliable, gentle, easily led young man. The kind of kid who says sorry when you step on his foot. In January 1998, he went in to face the same detective and met the same machinery. "We know you did it. You failed the tests. You will die unless you talk." Navy duty records placed him aboard his ship when Michelle was killed. An alibi most defendants would kill for, stamped and filed by the United States military. It did not matter. Nobody in that room wanted it to matter. After hours of Ford's method, Joseph Dick confessed to a crime his own service records said he could not have committed. And then he did something even sadder, something the psychologists who study false confessions consider the deepest form of the injury. He kept confessing. The story he had been handed grew roots in him. He repeated it to prosecutors, repeated it to himself, and would eventually stand up in court and testify to it against other innocent men in words that had been written for him in that room. That is what a single night in that room does to a 20-year-old. It doesn't just make him say the thing. It can make him carry it. Confession number 2. Mark the wall. In March 1998, Dick's DNA came back. Not him either. Now you might reasonably ask, why keep the confessions at all once the science keeps spitting them out? Here is the ugly, practical answer every prosecutor knows. To a jury, a confession is the sun. It outshines everything placed beside it. Alibis wilt next to it. Even DNA in 1998 could be talked around. A defendant who described the crime in his own voice must know something, mustn't he? A confession is not just evidence of guilt. It is a finished story, and finished stories win trials. Which means every man that room broke became a weapon against the next man, And the file grew heavier exactly as it grew more false. By now, the pattern is locking in where you can watch it work. Each exclusion should have been an exit. Each time, the theory simply grew another man. 2 attackers became 3 because 2 didn't explain the DNA either. Dick, pressed to explain why his biology wasn't in that apartment, produced more names. Names of sailors he barely knew, because the room does not accept "I don't know" as an answer. In April 1998, a sailor named Eric Wilson was questioned for about 9 hours and gave them confession number 3. Mark the wall. In June, his DNA was excluded. 8 days later, Derek Tice was arrested down in Florida, and after his own marathon in that room, he became confession number 4. Mark the wall. Tice pushed for still more names, gave them more names. 3 additional sailors, Richard Pauly, Jeffrey Ferris, John Dancer, were charged with capital murder on nothing but the words of the coerced. Sit with that. No confession of their own, no witness, no physical trace. Arrested for the death penalty on sentences other men had been broken into saying. None of the 3 ever confessed, which by this point almost reads as a scientific finding. The confessions tracked the interrogations, not the crime. Dancer's paperwork put him 300 miles away in Pennsylvania on the night. Time cards, bank records, the boring, beautiful proof of an ordinary alibi. He was charged with capital murder anyway. Count it with me. 7 United States Navy sailors, charged with 1 rape and 1 murder, a crime the medical examiner's own findings said was committed by 1 person in an apartment so small a 2-man fight would have wrecked it, with not 1 fingerprint, fiber, or cell of any of the 7 anywhere in it. The state's theory now required 7 men to have taken turns in that tiny room and to have left between them no trace at all, while somehow the trace of an 8th man, a man police weren't even looking at, was everywhere. A federal judge would eventually hold this theory up to the light and describe its absurdity in plain English. Multiple attackers, 1 shared weapon, wounds of a single uniform depth, and none of the supposed 7 leaving so much as a cell behind. Physics testified in this case. Nobody called it to the stand. In February 1999, the laboratory finished the arithmetic. All 7 charged men, every single one, excluded by DNA. 7 charges, 0 matches. And still, nobody walked free. The doors stayed shut, the trials stayed on the calendar, and the death penalty stayed on the table. Because by then, admitting the truth would have meant admitting what had been done in that room. Keep your tally. 4 confessions on the wall, all of them false. The 5th confession is coming, and it does not come from an interrogation room. It comes in the mail. In February 1959, a letter left a Virginia prison cell in an envelope, written by an inmate named Omar Ballard to a woman he knew back in Norfolk. Ballard was exactly the man police are supposed to find. He had known Michelle. A federal court would later note plainly that they were friends, that he had often been inside her apartment. He was the someone she knew her door open to, and his violence was not hidden. Days before Michelle was killed, a woman at the same apartment complex had been savagely beaten with a bat. Days after, a 14-year-old girl was raped a mile away. Both were Ballard. The second crime is why he was in prison months later, holding a pen. What he wrote in his own spelling, in his own hand, is quoted in the federal record. And I'll read it to you exactly. In one last thing you remember that night, I went to Mommy's house, and the next morning Michelle got killed. Guess who did that? Me, ha, ha. Guess who did that? Me? Ha, ha, ha. The letter reached the police. And now watch the machine do instantly everything it had refused to do for 2 years. Ballard's DNA was tested in March 1999. It matched. Not partially, not arguably. It matched the swabs, the fingernail scrapings, the blanket. He remains to this day the only human being whose DNA was ever found at that scene. Brought in, he confessed freely, no 11 hours required, and his confession needed no repairs. The details fit the apartment, fit the wounds, fit the night. And he said one more thing, twice, once in each statement he gave. He did it alone. No sailors, no accomplices. Alone. Exactly what the locked door, the small rooms, and the uniform wounds had been saying since the first morning. The 5th confession, the only true one, The wall now reads 4 lies extracted by professionals across hours of coercion and 1 truth mailed in voluntarily with a laugh. So they opened the cell doors and let the sailors go home. You know they didn't. This is the part of the story that separates it from every ordinary wrongful conviction. The part a federal judge would later stare at in something like disbelief. Presented with the real killer, matched by DNA, confessing voluntarily and alone, the prosecution did not drop its theory. It enlarged it again. Omar Ballard, they now announced, was simply the 8th man. The sailors' confessions, the ones that had been wrong until corrected, were still good. The man every shred of physical evidence pointed to was folded into the story as one more accomplice, over his own repeated insistence that he had acted entirely alone. Why? Not because anyone produced new evidence. There was none. There was never any. The honest answer is smaller and colder than a conspiracy. By 1999, the case had a momentum that truth couldn't afford to stop. One man had already pleaded guilty. Careers, verdicts, and a grieving family's certainty were all built on the confession wall. Tearing it down meant a prosecutor standing in front of Norfolk and saying, "We broke 4 innocent sailors, and the real killer was still free days after we had our first confession signed. Free when a 14-year-old girl was attacked a mile from that apartment." No one said that sentence in 1999. It would take 17 more years in a federal courtroom before anyone with power said it out loud. And the cruelest bookkeeping of all is in the dates, so look at them with me. Danial Williams had already pleaded guilty that January, a month before the letter, because his lawyers told him, correctly, that it was the plea or a probable death sentence. But Joseph Dick pleaded guilty in April 1999. April, after the letter, after the match. The Commonwealth accepted a guilty plea for life in prison from a DNA-excluded man a month and a half after its own laboratory identified the real killer. In May, the charges against Pauly, Ferris, and Dancer were quietly dropped, the theory shrinking back down now that it had its convictions in hand. That June, a jury acquitted Eric Wilson of murder but convicted him of rape on the strength of his coerced statement. He got 8.5 years. Derek Tice, who refused to fold, was convicted in February 2000 and sentenced to 2 life terms. The verdict was thrown out on appeal, and Norfolk simply tried him again in 2003 and convicted him again. And in March 2000, in the same courthouse system, Omar Ballard pleaded guilty to Michelle's rape and murder and took 2 life sentences, telling the court what he had told everyone: he acted alone. Hold both of those in your head at once. The state of Virginia accepted a guilty plea from Omar Ballard, who swore under oath that he had done this alone, while keeping 4 other men in prison for doing it with him. One more thing belongs here, and it needs to be said gently. Michelle's parents believed the confessions. Of course they did. 4 men had said the words in detail on paper, and the people who extracted those words assured her family they were true. Her mother and father spent those years and many after certain the sailors were their daughter's killers and fighting to keep them behind bars. That is not a failing in them. It is the second cruelty of a false confession. It doesn't just cage the innocent, it hands a grieving family a lie to build their grief on. Whatever anger you're feeling right now, aim it at the method, never at them. Years then, that's what innocence costs once a system has decided to protect its own story. Williams inside since 1997. Dick since 1998. Tice convicted twice. Wilson finished his sentence and walked out in 2005 into a different cage. A rape conviction meant the sex offender registry, and the registry meant, among 1,000 daily humiliations, that he could not adopt his own stepson. Added up across the 4 of them, and you get more than 40 years of stolen time for a crime the state's own files proved was one other man's. But out in the world, the case had begun to rot in public view because the file, honestly read, is not ambiguous. It never was. Any competent stranger who sat down with it saw the same 3 columns. Confessions that contradicted the scene until they were fixed, DNA that cleared every sailor and convicted exactly 1 man, and that man on record, under oath, saying he did it alone. In 2005, lawyers filed clemency petitions on the governor's desk. In 2008 came a book about the case called The Wrong Guys, co-written by one of the country's leading false confession scholars, And then something close to unprecedented. A public letter from 26 retired FBI agents. Men who had spent entire careers inside interrogation rooms. Men whose professional religion is the confession. Telling Virginia's governor the convictions were a tragic mistake, that the confessions had never been checked against the evidence. 10 former Virginia attorneys general joined. Retired judges. Former prosecutors. Even jurors from the original trials, 13 of them, saying publicly, "We were not shown the truth." When the people who built the machine start writing letters against the machine, you are watching something rare, and you should slow down and look. In August 2009, Governor Tim Kaine granted conditional pardons, and 3 men walked out of prison after roughly 11 and 12 years each. Watch the word conditional, though, because this is a half-open door, not an ending. Their convictions stood. They were felons. They registered all of them as sex offenders, reporting their addresses, photographed for the registries, flagged in every background check, treated by the paperwork of daily life as the predators someone else had scripted them to be. Try renting an apartment like that. Try explaining it at a job interview. Yes, capital murder, but conditionally pardoned. Kaine himself, releasing them, pointedly declined to call them innocent. The state's mercy arrived with its accusations still attached. In November 2010, PBS aired a frontline documentary about the case that much of America found unwatchable in the best sense. And understand this, when that famous film ended, the story you are hearing now had no ending yet. The film could not tell you the 4 were innocent because no court had said so. It could not tell you what happened to the detective because that verdict was 13 days old and the sentence hadn't come down. Everything that follows happened after the credits rolled. Here is what followed, in the order the truth finally won. In 2011, the federal courts finished with Derek Tice. His conviction was gone. His lawyer's failure to challenge that coerced confession was fatal to the verdict. And that August, prosecutors gave up and dropped the charges. One name clean. In September 2016, the remaining 2 men's case landed in front of a federal judge named John A. Gibney Jr. He did what nobody in Norfolk had done in 1997. He actually held the confessions up against the evidence. In a 2-day hearing, on the record, with the whole 19-year file open in front of him. And then he did something federal judges almost never do, because the law only asks them to find errors, not truth. He ruled that Danial Williams and Joseph Dick were not merely entitled to new trials. They were actually innocent. His written words belong on screen. By any measure, the evidence shows the defendant's innocence, by a preponderance of the evidence, by clear and convincing evidence, by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, or even by conclusive evidence. Elsewhere in the opinion, he put it more bluntly. No sane human being, he wrote, could find them guilty. That October, Virginia's own Attorney General stopped defending the convictions, and Gibney erased them. In March 2017, Governor Terry McAuliffe granted absolute pardons to all 4 men, including Eric Wilson, who had no court left to turn to because he'd finished his sentence before the truth caught up. 20 years after that first 11-hour night, the last conviction dissolved, the registry entries were wiped, and the words the record now carries next to their names are the ones a judge had already written: innocent. In 2018, the money followed the words. The Commonwealth of Virginia paid $3.5 million. The city of Norfolk paid $4.9 million more. Roughly $8.4 million total, which sounds like a great deal of money until you divide it by 4 men and 40-plus stolen years, and realize it prices an innocent man's year at roughly the cost of a middling house. Understand what the money is and what it isn't. No one was ever criminally punished for what was done to these 4 men in that interrogation room. The check is the closest thing to an apology the record contains, and even the check took 21 years. And now the last tally mark. I've kept one thing from you. Robert Glenn Ford, the detective in every one of those rooms, the man the confessions have in common, had done this before. In 1990, years before Michelle was killed, Ford extracted confessions from 3 teenagers in a Norfolk robbery murder. False ones. It was known. He was moved off homicide and then quietly moved back. That is who was waiting in the room when Danial Williams sat down. Ford was never criminally charged for what he did to the Norfolk 4. Understand that plainly, because this film doesn't sell false comfort. The system never punished him for its own catastrophe. But in 2010, while the four were still legally rapists and murderers, while Frontline was still editing its film, federal agents came for Ford on something else. For years, it turned out, the veteran detective had been taking cash from criminal defendants in exchange for favorable treatment. Extortion under color of his badge. And when the FBI asked him about it, he lied to them. A federal crime with its own delicious symmetry, because Robert Glenn Ford, of all men, was undone by a false statement made under pressure in an interview room. A jury convicted him that October, less than 2 weeks before the Frontline broadcast. In February 2011, a federal judge sentenced him to 12.5 years, a longer sentence than Eric Wilson served for a rape that never involved him. The man who filled a wall with false confessions went into a federal prison cell, and the United States Navy sailors he put away went home, pardoned, paid, and declared by a federal court to be exactly what they had said they were at hour 1, hour 5, and hour 10 of that first long night, before hour 11 finally broke them. So count the confessions one last time. Danial Williams, false, extracted before dawn. Joseph Dick, false, rehearsed until he believed it. Eric Wilson, false, 9 hours. Derek Tice, false, and he paid for recanting it with 2 trials. And Omar Ballard, true, mailed from a prison cell with a taunt, matched by every piece of DNA in the file, sworn to the end, alone. 4 false confessions took a marathon night apiece to build. The one true confession arrived by mail, free of charge, and the system that had sweated through all those nights couldn't bring itself to open the envelope. That is the lesson of Norfolk, and it is not comfortable. An interrogation room is a factory, and what it manufactures is agreement. Get the wrong man inside it for long enough, and he will hand you a murder in his own voice. Wrong in every detail until you fix it for him. The DNA never lied in this case. Not once, not to anyone. People simply preferred the confessions because the confessions were theirs. Michelle Moore-Bosko would be in her 40s now. Her killer confessed in 1999 and is serving 2 life sentences. Her parents grieved twice, once for her and once for the years they were told a lie about who took her. 4 sailors gave the Navy their youth. Virginia took the years that followed. And the detective who called that justice got to test, from the inside, how it feels when the government decides what your words are going to mean. If you believe the count matters, that 4 false confessions should weigh less than 1 drop of the truth, hit like so the next jury that hears the words, "But he confessed," remembers this story.